Another year, another Solasta campaign DLC. Keep 'em coming, right?
Wrong.
See, every IP outstays its welcome at some point. It's a historical inevitability. And in the case of this endearing little cheeseburger of an intellectual property, for me, this point is Palace of Ice. Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumping for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And if you have been following along, you also know that I review games using a system of categories that I feel are relevant to the genre of the game at hand. But I don't do that with DLCs, so if you are curious about how the base game fared in aspects such as character creation, gameplay, or secondary mechanics, you can always check our review on Solasta Crown of the Magister. I'll leave a link to it in the description section down below. But I do think that revisiting all the goody things Solasta Crown of the Magister and the Lost Valley DLC had to offer is in order for this video. Solasta was released at a time in which its more popular cousin Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous was all the talk. Owlcat's 180-hour plus behemoth of a game had been out for less than 2 months by the time Solasta hit the stores, and despite that, it was decently successful with a good chunk of the D&D CRPG crowd. Solasta was an unpretentious title that played to its strengths for the most part, and even dared to bring a little something extra to the party. Its story was goofy, and it progressed mostly by means of poorly written tropey plot devices. But except a few assholes on the internet, most people didn't give the game too much shit for this, because the game's strong suit was never meant to be the story, and most people were okay with that. Character models were atrocious for a game that came out in the year 2021. But most people didn't care too much about this either, because the game's core target audience is more than used to seeing ugly characters. They all have a mirror at home after all. Solasta Crown of the Magister's campaign was also super linear, and from a narrative perspective, it had almost zero replay value. But when a good chunk of the game's core audience refers to the original Icewind Dale as lightning in a bottle, I think we can safely assume that at least that portion of the audience wasn't too offended with Solasta's lack of decision notes and branching story paths. The bottom line is that Solasta didn't need to excel at any of these things to be successful. It didn't even try. Tactical Adventures focused mostly on making a fun game. A game that, in my opinion, had excellent combat, great pace, except for the stupid ambushes, and dungeons and locations that weren't too big to become too tedious and outstay their welcome, but large enough to feel adventure-y and to make exploration matter. But my favorite thing about Solasta Crown of the Magister was, hands down, this little feature here. This feature allowed you to choose various personality traits for every character in your party, and though Solasta is not the only game that has ever had this feature, no other title that I know of has ever rewarded my choice of personality traits so richly. See, in Wildermyth, you can customize each of your character's personalities by means of this impressive interface that even allows you to prioritize all of your character's personality traits. But that has exactly zero impact on your character's behavior during the game's story bits, to the point that they all felt like generic husks that were randomly given dialogue lines during the game's cutscenes. And I know that Solasta's personality trait system is a bit of a game of smoke and mirrors, as you're always going to get the exact same cutscenes and dialogues regardless of your party members' personalities. But at least it feels like the game acknowledges the choices that you make in this little box here all the way through. I created this red-headed halfling rogue called Syl, and I wanted her to be chaotic, greedy, cynical, and fond of making all sorts of jokes at all times. And of course, I chose the voice that I wanted to go with that combination, and she turned out to be my favorite video game companion of the last 5 years.
Really?
And it was all because of the input that I had as a player in her personality. And again, I know that everyone who plays this game gets the exact same conversations that I got, but in my case, every cynical comment, every unexpected joke, every crazy idea that puzzled the rest of the party members came from Syl. Always, consistently, unequivocally.
This place is topsy-turvy.
Remind me not to take a dump in that hole.
Do you really have to make jokes?
Yeah, it's in my contract. Did Karen not tell you?
Who else? Even without Airdroth, blood spear never followed Yarks.
Yarks. Huh, that's us, just so you know. Probably means piece of...
It means non-orcs, that's all.
you speak Orcish?
Enough to know non-orc from piece of...
Really? Oh, please, what's the word? I must know.
It's similar to some magical wards I've seen.
It doesn't work. Perhaps he made a spelling mistake.
I hate you.
Praise be.
He sounds like Beric's Sunblaze.
Don't.
It was a compliment.
And it was always the same party member who wanted to strangle her whenever she said something goofy. Let's say this image here represents the evolution of medieval fantasy RPGs, and not me showing off that I finally beat Monster Train in the hardest Covenant level. Almost every game in the genre has added a little something to this evolution, and one might argue that some brought in a heck of a lot more than others. The way I see it, Solasta's personality trait system and the way it played out in the game was this title's major contribution to the genre's evolution, because Solasta's combat was good, but we had already seen turn-based combat in non-flat layouts before in several other games. Dungeons with multiple accesses and secret passageways are one of the best things about Solasta, but this had also been a thing in D&D for ages before Solasta came out. But this little feature, having an impact, however small, on every cutscene and conversation, this was magical. But this feature was not the only refreshing thing Solasta had going for it. The game was not without its little juicy treats that you don't see every day. Flying around with your wizard and walking through walls, if you have the spider climb talent, was too damn satisfactory. And being able to push an elite enemy with hundreds of health points off a ravine for an insta-kill? The satisfaction. But I still think it's your character's personalities that steal the show in this game. Now take note of this because it'll be important later. Now let's talk about an expansion pack's duty, mission, and purpose in life. An expansion pack, or DLC like you boys and girls like to call it these days, has its work cut out for it if you think of it. It only needs to take those things people loved about the core game and take them to the next level. And it also needs to implement those features people wished had been in the core game and get rid of the things that people didn't like about it. And that shouldn't be all that difficult, really, because once the core game comes out, people will let developers know, in more ways than they can handle probably, what they liked and what they didn't like about the game. So it's just a matter of taking the order and getting the paying customer what he or she wants. In theory, of course. But some development teams like to live on the edge and try to boldly go where the core game had never gone before. And some of those knock it out of the park, like Blood Dragon, the standalone expansion pack for Far Cry 3. Holy shit, I didn't expect any of the things that I saw in that game. And some others fall by the wayside despite having boatloads of good ideas, like Storm of Sahir for Neverwinter Nights 2. And then there are some others that do both of these things. They grab all the things that were awesome about the core game, blend them into a delicious stew, and infuse it with mind-blowing, jaw-dropping ideas that no one ever saw coming. And when this works, you get masterpieces like Heart of Stone or Blood and Wine for The Witcher 3 or Mask of the Betrayer for Neverwinter Nights 2. But those are pretty exceptional, and I don't think most people expect every expansion pack to be Mask of the Betrayer or Blood and Wine. If, as a developer, you stick to taking everything that was good about your game to the next level and trimming the fat a little, you should be okay with your DLC. Lost Valley, the first campaign-based DLC for Solasta Crown of the Magister, was nothing out of this world, and it did fuck up a few things here and there. The writing was even worse than it was in the first game, and it was riddled with bugs and glitches. There were even several ways in which the player could break the game to the point of not even getting a final cutscene. For Lost Valley DLC, it seems like Tactical Adventures made the critical mistake of listening too much to that part of the audience who didn't like the core game because it was too linear, instead of focusing on improving upon those things that everyone loved about the game despite the fact that it was too linear. But despite that, Lost Valley still managed to improve upon many of the core game's best features. It had the 2 best dungeons in the series. No, scratch that. It had 2 of the best dungeons ever. It had more complex and challenging combat encounters, which was a welcome upgrade because the core game was a little too easy, even in the highest difficulty level, and it also introduced a few situations in which you could sidestep combat if you had a good enough level of a non-combat skill like sneaking. It was not perfect, not by a long shot, but I still think it was a net positive for the series and for the D&D RPG world. But one thing that worried me a bit going forward was that this time around, those little conversations that your party members used to have in the core campaign were reduced to almost zero. That was the single most likable thing about the core game. Seeing the characters you created stick to the personality traits that you gave them every time they talked to each other or during these cutscenes was simply magical. In the core game, when my party found the crown of the Magister, my wizard Shanna was the one who took it for herself, and when she became sick because of it, Jeslik was the first one to manifest his concern. And this brought a smile to my face because I had specifically assigned kindness and altruism as his two most important personality traits. But your party taking breaks to discuss the situation from time to time seemed to happen less and less as you progressed through the game in the Lost Valley DLC. But after I finished this campaign, I still wanted Tactical Adventures to give me more Solasta. And I had the sneaking suspicion that we were going to get more. And we did. We got the Inner Strength DLC, which added the Dragonborn race, the Bard, the Warlock, and Monk classes, each of which had 4 sets of subclasses, and the Ascetic, the Artist, and the Occultist backgrounds, in addition to several new feats. And all of that D&D goodness, in addition to the Half-Orc race and the Druid and Barbarian classes that were introduced in the Primal Calling DLC, and the Sorcerer class that we got from an upgrade, were going to be available for the next thing that would come out later, the Palace of Ice expansion pack. The Palace of Ice DLC brought 2 major things to Solasta, a full-length campaign and major improvements and additions to the Dungeon Maker feature. And the latter were so big and game-changing that they elevated the Dungeon Maker to Campaign Maker even. And to be fair, if custom dungeon design is where you find your fun in these games, then you're going to love this game to death. Because even I have started to take an interest in this feature when I really had never cared much about it in other D&D games. But on this video I am going to focus mostly on the campaign, because I am first and foremost a single-player campaign guy. And I was not happy by the end of the game with Palace of Ice's campaign, so let's rip off the bandage, shall we? Palace of Ice is a high-level adventure for which you can create a new cast of characters from scratch if you want to take advantage of all those new races, classes, and other D&D goodness we mentioned. You can also import your original party from the core campaign, or if you want, you can also choose to give some of those pre-made characters a spin. Well, so far so good, but then the adventure starts. And I had a bad feeling about this one since the initial cutscene. At the beginning of the game, there is this brief recollection of events, and in my case, the game got it completely wrong. Shanna was the one who wore the crown of the Magister, not Brogank as the cutscene showed, and Syl was the one who showed the council the Sorak head, not Shanna. And this made me feel like the game had just stopped giving a shit about my decisions, when that hadn't been the case in the core game, which, like I said before, had always taken care to give all my characters the appropriate dialogue lines at all times. But to be fair, I did feel a small breeze of hope and relief with the game's first moment. It was your good old band of adventurers discussing what to do next, something that I had felt had become progressively scarcer in the previous title. Looks like the good old cheesy Solasta is back, I thought. But unfortunately that relief was short-lived because the game immediately devolved into the worst version of Solasta. For the entire first half, the game grabs you by the wrist and drags you from combat to conversation to combat to conversation on a hyperlinear journey that makes the original Solasta feel like Fallout in comparison. The only thing that you are free to do between one event and the other is trade. The rest is an endless succession of quest marker chases in which there isn't even room for you to engage in the simplest exploration. At least in the first game, every location had an area or two that you could wander off into to see if there was anything interesting, like this goblin-infested area in the first location that you really didn't have to go to if you didn't want to, or the alternative way into the Dark Tower, or the many hidden rooms that you could only access if you could fly or if you had the spider climb talent. But you have to play roughly 50% of the game in Palace of Ice before you get to a point in which you are more or less allowed to choose what you want to do next or where you want to go. And even then, all the places that you can go to consist of a medium-sized area where there are 2 or 3 groups of monsters. It's formulaic and repetitive, and not as fun as it used to be. I would even say it's lazy, if it were not for the fact that cities and towns in this expansion pack are way bigger and more detailed than any of the towns we've visited before in this series. A lot of effort and inspiration went into the design of these places, I'll give you that much, but the dungeons and locations in which the combat takes place could have used a little bit of that. They aren't even a bad imitation of the best dungeons in the Lost Valley DLC. Actually, there are only 2 dungeons in this game that are even remotely worth being called such, and one of them you only get to explore at the very end of the game. The story is cheesy, of course, even by Solasta standards, and it's pushed forward by almost completely random plot convenient events that are sometimes so bad that they turn out to be good. Unintentionally good, that is. But giving Solasta shit for its story, it's like criticizing the Skrillex haircut on an LGBT activist. It's expected, it won't change anytime soon, and there are worse things about it. What you want to know about the story in Palace of Ice is that this time your mission is to get every rival faction in the game to lend you a hand to fend off the mustache-twirling evil guy. And this entails, of course, taking care of a number of your standard fare kid pro quo quests before each faction commits to your cause. Every faction has 2 major groups, and you have the choice of aiding one or the other, and choosing one over the other does change things very slightly. It has no real impact in the larger scheme of things, and the game doesn't give 2 shits about who you choose beyond a dialogue line or 2. Actually, I chose to side with this treacherous asshole because I was a bit tired of the matriarchy in this game, and it seems like the developers were so confident that everyone was going to choose the female general instead of this traitor that at some point he just starts talking with General Matriarchy's voice.
Good luck.
The story also makes a hilariously clumsy attempt to sell you the final decision of the game as an all-or-nothing choice, in which there's so much at stake. Spoiler alert, I guess, if you even care about the story in this DLC. The choice is to sacrifice the soul of an NPC who is already dead and with whom you've not had more than 3 or 4 conversations over the course of the game, or one of your party members, so that you can use its soul to open up a portal back into your world. What makes this situation even worse is the fact that the game could have used this final moment to reward you for having a wizard in your party with X spell, or having Y scroll, or having, I don't know, gone out of your way to do a side quest from which you got Z magical bullshit item as a reward. An item whose sole purpose could have been to circumvent the final sacrifice altogether. But asking this of Solasta is like hoping never to see this haircut again in a video game. It just won't happen. There's absolutely nothing like this in Solasta Palace of Ice. There is almost no use for your skills outside of combat. At least in the Lost Valley DLC, there were a couple of situations or 3 in which you could sneak your way around a combat encounter, and some of those were pretty important. If you were a staunch defender of this DLC, I guess you could say that the campaign focuses mostly on combat, and that's why it's light in almost everything else. But it feels as though the developers had said, listen boys, combat is the only thing we're going to care about this time. Everything else is fat that needs to be trimmed. And I don't think combat in Palace of Ice is all that great to begin with. There are 2 or 3 really good combat encounters, but the rest feels like more of the same. Some of them were even tedious. And that comes as a shock to me because I've always felt like Solasta's fights were pretty cleverly tailored to the game's turn-based combat mechanic. This time I feel like some of the fights have too many ads, and too many ads and turn-based combat is just
not a great plan.
There are new enemies in this DLC, but I didn't feel like I had to squeeze new tactics out of my brain to deal with them. For the most part, I could rely on my tried and true formulas. And to me, this works a little bit against the game's fun factor, because I would much rather be challenged to out-strategize a combat encounter than be given a 500 billion new combinations of classes and archetypes. But I think the fun in all these CRPGs, and that includes D&D role-playing games, lies in figuring out what works for you. And Solasta used to be great with this. I don't know, man, when I played Solasta for the first time, I just did what I always do. I rolled 4 characters and chose a class for each of them that I felt complemented the others. And I chose the archetype that I felt was more useful to the role that I wanted each character to play in the party, and I went with that. And I managed to complete all 3 campaigns in the hardest difficulty without too much trouble. And whenever I got stuck, I could always try new tactics, and most of the times these tactics were all about doing different things rather than boring myself to death with mind-numbing trial and error processes of different spells to see which one got the job done. One thing that I like about all Solasta games is that you can overcome every combat encounter by simply trying different things. There are no fights that funnel you into doing the one thing that works, and I love this. Palace of Ice is no exception, but you can rely on your tried and true tactics for many of the fights, while Lost Valley really pushed you to the limits in almost every combat encounter. Also, the level layout for most combat encounters in the original campaign and in Lost Valley felt more varied and tactically relevant. This time around, most of the times it doesn't go beyond a high ground or two and some columns here and there. There are of course a few notable exceptions, but that's what they are, exceptions. I will say this, for those of you who are loot whores, this game has some pretty fantastic items for every class. And with the appropriate reputation and money, you can buy a few OP items that will make a world of difference in that final dungeon. But the single worst thing about this DLC is that it didn't care at all about my choices, about any of my choices. In the original game, you often came upon situations in which you had to decide which of your characters you wanted to take the reins of a conversation. And not everyone had the same chance of succeeding. Some NPCs were a bit more likely to be persuaded than intimidated, and with some others, it was the other way around. Sometimes your characters would suggest different approaches, and choosing one over the other could potentially yield different results. This made the choices you made at the character creation screen matter in the game beyond combat. This time, your dialogue options, for a large chunk of the game, are a mockery of the very concept of choice. It's not like you choose one or the other. These options are here only for you to choose the order in which you want to ask these questions, because you need to ask all these questions to end the conversation. There was not a single outcome in Palace of Ice that I can recall that depended on my character's persuasion or intimidation skills. Also, like I said, I felt like the original game went to great lengths to make my characters always sound consistent with their personality traits. In Palace of Ice, for at least the first half of the game, my mages and thieves' personalities got mixed up, and my mage, who had been naive, timid, and a bit of an aristocratic snob all the way through in the first game, started cracking witty one-liners in Palace of Ice.
Clear skies, heroes of the Rift.
My, are we that recognizable?
Well, no, but Steeg sent word that you were coming.
So it's not my good looks. What a disappointment.
And Syl started talking about history and shit. This got fixed at some point in the game, and good old Syl went back to being her old cynical self again.
You may address me as Lord of Assholes.
Shut up.
But the game took its sweet little time to sort it out, and I was angry at it because of this. Not angry, more like ninja when someone does something stupid.
Hi, my name is Erin. I use she, her pronouns, and I am Miss.
To me, Palace of Ice has two halves. The first one is boring, extremely linear, and it feels as though all the care the series had put into making your characters' personalities and skills matter went out the window for this one. But then you hit the city of White Rock City. And that's where things changed dramatically for the better. The city of White Rock is the most inspired city you've ever seen in Solasta. Caer Kiflin and Copperan from the original game look amateurish and bland in comparison, but White Rock looks alive, busy, and most importantly, lived in. It's a city in which you can clearly tell what's going on around its different parts. There are refugee settlements, noble quarters, common quarters, and all of them look like the product of their inhabitants' costumes and social dynamics. There are vendors, tavern keepers, and even enthusiastic young adventurers willing to join you for an expedition or two. The elven settlements are a bit of a tropey concept, but they look amazing. It's a proper cliché elven town. And you have to give props to those who designed it. If there were an Arcanum remake, this is what I would want Kintara to look like. There are also a few decisions that you can make while carrying out your quid pro quo missions that have a mild impact on the way things play out. At least you get different dialogue sequences depending on who you help, which is way more than you got in the first half of the game. You also get a couple of non-mandatory epic boss fights and a couple of interesting puzzles. But except this dragon, which was quite challenging before I figured out how to beat it, I'll give it that, everything feels like more of the same. Those endearing little moments of party banter that you had in the original game have been reduced to a minimum. Dungeons like the ones you had in Lost Valley are almost nowhere to be found, and the overall excitement that one got from the original game feels spent. Also, there is an opinion out there that seems to be gaining traction lately, and it's that in order to get the enjoyment you expect out of a D&D RPG from Solasta, you must purchase the Lightbringer edition, which includes every DLC and update. And that one was going for $84, and it's now available for $38.78. A 54% discount for a bundle pack that includes a DLC that came out just 2 months ago. I don't know, maybe it's part of one of those Steam sales or special deals, but it is suspicious all the same. I thoroughly enjoyed Solasta Crown of the Magister, and if you are an RPG guy or gal, I recommend you give the core game a shot. And if you like it, then go for the Lost Valley DLC. And if you still want more after that, then maybe go for Palace of Ice. But if you are left with a bittersweet taste after the Lost Valley DLC, know that this expansion pack will do very little to rekindle your love for Solasta. And needless to say, if you weren't crazy about Solasta in the first place, give this one a hard pass, because this one is where the series outstays its welcome.
You may address me as Lord of Assholes.
If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, come check us out on Discord, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.